Good morning. This is week 7 of the Introduction to Cultural Studies, and today I'd like to talk with you about parenthood. As you remember, last week we talked about different historical forms of family life. Here you have a quick list, a quick reminder of different forms of family life that were dominant. Of course, these are not the only possible existent arrangements of private and family life, but these are the historical forms of family life that were dominant in the Western culture before the popularization of the modern family. So hopefully you remember them. What you remember also is that even with the questions concerning very private or intimate aspects of life, culture is still very important. So if we read historical texts written in earlier centuries, if we read novels or other works set in the previous centuries, it is quite typical to expect different forms of family life. So, of course, children are a very important part of family life in all cultures. Of course, family structures, motherhood, fatherhood, family relations, including intergenerational relations, are the natural backbone of all human interaction, and as such they have always been present in human society and also in human culture, in mythology, in stories that people tell, and they are a very important source of reference, even at a personal level, because everybody, regardless of the numbers of people on earth, was born somehow, and vast majority of people have some memories of early interactions with their immediate caregivers. But just as we could ask ourselves the question of why people get married and does it change historically, there have been scholars and anthropologists and philologists and philosophers asking questions like, why do people have children? Of course, you have to remember that for a very long time it wasn't left to the person's decision whether or not to have children if they chose to be active sexually, because there was no effective contraception. This is again the development of the second half of the 20th century. Before, there were some attempts, and we can argue what was available and to what extent it was effective, but in general, when people started to have sexual relations, it was more or less taken for granted that children would follow. So many people didn't ask themselves the question why to have children, which only appeared in the 20th century when such decision could be made. So why do people have children? Here are some possible answers. For example, many people just love babies and small children. The babies and children look cute. This is something that's true on a psychological level. This is true also about certain animals, small animals especially, large heads, large eyes, cuddly, plump bodies, a lot of eye contact, a lot of smiling. This is something that makes people want to care about such creatures, and for large numbers of people, children and babies are just sweet and beautiful, and they evoke the feelings of care in them. Another reason, they want to carry on the family name and values. It could be, of course, especially in the historical perspective, something like an aristocratic title, or the legacy of lands, or maybe in the modern context, a family firm. But also the values of the culture that people find important and they want to preserve. They want someone to look after them in the old age. The famous quote about the glass of water, who will give you the glass of water. So this is a sort of insurance, old age insurance, that many people consider parenthood to be. They want to give meaning to their lives. Again, this is considered by many people that having children brings meaning and value to their own lives. You might argue that this is the function of responsibility that having children entails, and if you think about it, the people are mostly proud of what they have achieved through effort and responsibility. So you might argue that having children is a tremendous effort and great responsibility, and for many people this can add to the feeling of fulfillment and meaning in their lives. They want to give unconditional love. So even if the mercantile reasons, such as insurance for old age, are not considered, many people just want to love somebody, they want to care for somebody unconditionally, and in case of children it's perhaps a bit easier than in case of another adult person, because children are born with very limited knowledge of the world, and you can mold them to accept whatever you want them to accept. Also, as you can see, these are basically personal reasons that many people have. The majority of people in the society would admit to having such reasons. There are also societal reasons for reproduction. For example, it is expected by their family members. So you might experience pressure from especially older generations in your family to produce grandchildren or even great-grandchildren as the form of the survival of the legacy of the family as a group. Some people, they want to create life and mold it. So again, something I already mentioned, children are born with very limited knowledge of the world, and you can mold them, you can teach them whatever you wish, in fact. Or, the last one here on the list, it is required by their religion, and this is why we have this sweet image of Virgin Mary and baby Jesus. As you can see, motherhood, parenthood in general, but motherhood especially, is central to many religions. Probably because it's such an important and formative human experience for everybody, even those who do not have children. If you do not have children, you had a mother, you had parents, and most people have some sort of memories of their parents. So you could probably come up with some more reasons why people have children. You may ask yourself whether you feel any of these things, and this is definitely something that is very important culturally and represented in culture in very many diverse ways. However, there is one more thing that is rarely mentioned, and this is a relatively new concept in cultural studies, the concept which is called repronormativity. And it sounds a little bit like heteronormativity that you may remember from earlier parts. So the assumption, the cultural assumption that something, in this case having children, reproduction, in the case of heteronormativity, heterosexual behavior, is the only possible way, is default, is natural, good, moral, and all other positive things that you can associate with it. So this moves from the descriptive depiction of cultural behaviors to prescriptive behaviors, that is, teaching people or persuading people to behave in a socially acceptable way. So just as with all other more or less controversial aspects of human private behavior, the fact that most people, according to different studies, around 80% of people want to have children, doesn't mean that it's true for absolutely everybody. But culture, mostly through cultural hegemony, so cultural dominance of certain values and behaviors, tries to persuade or perhaps encourage or even coerce some people who do not accept this concept naturally from the psychological point of view into accepting it on the grounds of let's say cultural conformity. So what we have here are some concepts, some ideas that could point to the presence of repronormativity in the modern society. For example, you are not a family if there are no children, or you are not fully mature if you have not conceived a child, or you are not a true woman or true man, whatever that means, without children. Or if you love somebody, you should want to have children with them. Or having a child is not a personal decision, but a duty towards the community. Care about children should be the most important concern of laws and politicians. So as you can see, it goes far beyond the private life. It's about the community, the laws, the politicians. The state should help people with children and or punish those without them. For example, by imposing higher taxes on them. So this goes far beyond the private sphere into lawmaking, into legal punishment. So as you can see, the change of discourse here, if you remember Michel Foucault and his concept of discourse, especially dealing with the concepts of language and power. So there is a lot of language of power here used to coerce people who do not want to follow this social rule into acceptance of this social rule. And the question is why? And probably when we talk about modernity, when we talk about politics, you will see that private behavior of people has always been the focus of attention of the state, and especially the authoritarian state, the totalitarian state being the most extreme case of authoritarianism, wants to breed people basically like cattle, because if you have more citizens or more subjects, you can have more profits from them. So It's not a fully private thing if you consider such private or even intimate decisions as to have whether to have or not to have children. This is just some sort of introduction, and if we look at the way culture has treated children, it follows more or less the historical development of different forms of family life and different influences on private life, on family life, which would be expressed in the treatment of children as members of family groups. So let's look at possible ways of treating children within the family in culture. So as you can see, these ways can be very different. Actually, it's not the question of choosing from the range. These possibilities are actually exclusive. And they boil down to the concepts that children, as such, newborn babies, are either evil or neutral or good, or perhaps determined at conception. And in different moments in history, there was a dominance of certain points of view. So as you can see, you have a full range, from babies being goodness incarnate to being evil incarnate. Why should anyone think that children are evil? If we look back to the Puritan times, to the 17th century, the restricted patriarchal nuclear family, and the development of certain, especially very strict Puritan forms of Protestantism, but it goes back earlier as well, perhaps not in this extreme form, but it's been quite an important aspect of Christian religion. There is the concept of the original sin. So the concept that all humans are born guilty. They are born with some sort of flaw, something that even a little child is not innocent of, because as descendants of Adam and Eve, they are subjected to the fallibility of human nature. It's not only the Christian religion. Some other religions have such elements. So the myths about the creation of first humans sometimes have this evil element already present in the first human beings, and some cultures have this notion of the innate evil of children. So if we consider children as evil, what they mostly need is correction and discipline. So if you know anything about the historical forms of family life in the 17th century, in Puritan Britain or other Protestant countries, or even in early America, the ways that people brought up their children was very strict, very concerned with religious observance, and there was a lot of punishment, including physical punishment, so spanking and other forms of physical violence directed towards children, explained as the behavior to help children overcome their natural evil impulses. So this basic assumption about the goodness or badness of children is reflected in the style of parenthood, in the style of upbringing, and it has very, very far-reaching consequences. Then in the 18th century, so in the Age of Reason, we have the concept that children are fully neutral. They are born as tabula rasa, if you remember John Locke's famous phrase, which means a blank page, a blank slate. So children are completely neutral. When a new person comes to the world, they are ready to be molded by experience. So whether they will turn out good or bad is relative to what influence they are subjected from the first moments of their life. If they are met with love and care and kindness, they will grow up to be good and valuable people in the society. If they are met with violence and evil, they will turn out to be bad people. So this is a completely new idea, a very rational idea brought in the Enlightenment period. Then, as you will see in a moment, the later ideas in the late 18th century, in the Romantic period, tend even further towards the side of goodness. As you'll see in a moment, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a very important philosopher, sometimes seen as the father, the kind of philosophical father of Romanticism, believed that children are good. This is a utopian view, so idealized view of the kind of lost paradise. Children are born good, they have the natural goodness, they are perfect little creations, and if they turn out bad in later life, it's only the bad influence of the society. They are corrupted by the human fallibility. They lose their natural goodness and their natural innocence. So that's the Romantic view. There were some other views, and sometimes you can hear about them. They are rediscovered in new form. And here is my fairy baby. That's my fairy baby. Are you good or bad? She's perfect. She's perfect. Her name is Minnie. And the other possibility is, for example, that children are determined at conception. So whether they will turn out good or bad is determined at the moment of either the birth or even at the moment of conception. There is the old way of looking at this deterministic concepts, for example, through astrology, the positioning of the stars and planets at the point of birth or conception of a new person. This was quite popular in the Renaissance. So for example, whenever a new member of the royal family was born, horoscopes were made to predict the future life and personality and talents of this new person. But also, if we look at the modern concepts, for example, of genetic determinism, so everything about a human being is determined at conception through the genes they inherit from their parents. So you cannot really do much. Everything is decided in the very structure, biological structure of each cell of your body. So it's a very deterministic, mechanistic idea, which actually questions the reality, for example, of the concept of the free will. According to some natural scientists, biologists, we cannot decide about anything. It all happens kind of automatically, mechanically, and whatever we think we can decide, it's purely our own illusion. I don't know if you believe in that. I wouldn't like to believe in that, and I wouldn't like it to be true, and I hope there is more to human experience than just some sort of biological determinism. Of course, if we study humanist subjects, and especially the expressions of human creativity, it paints a kind of optimistic picture that not everything is determined and mechanistic in human life. So let's continue in a moment. Okay, so continuing with the philosophical reactions to human children and parenting. I already mentioned the name of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I hope you remember this name from one of the earlier parts of this lecture. He was a French language philosopher living in Switzerland, and he is sometimes credited or blamed, if you will, for the popularization of Romanticism and even for the outbreak of the French Revolution. So something that tremendously changed the world in the late 18th century. He was interested in many things concerning human experience, and he was actually one of the first philosophers in the West to take active interest in the study or the observation of children. He is sometimes credited for seeing the process of growing up in humans from infancy to adulthood as a kind of process with its own stages. So from infancy through childhood, through adolescence, and only then to adulthood. In fact, I would say, if you know anything about Rousseau's private life and especially his experience of fatherhood, he wouldn't really be the best philosopher to consult in any of these matters. He had many children, I think at least 5 children, with a woman he did not marry, so they were living in some sort of open partnership. And unfortunately she died while the children were still quite young, and Rousseau basically summarily sent his children to an orphanage, and they were never heard of again. So it tells you something about the way that some philosophers treat their philosophy. They do not practice what they preach, and perhaps this could be seen as a very serious flaw in Rousseau's character and even perhaps in his philosophy. Although his philosophical writings, and especially the book that he published in 1762 called Emile, or on education, have been very influential in the development of modern pedagogy and the ideas about child rearing and education. It's a kind of novel with a lot of philosophical musing thrown in. Emile is a boy's name. He's the main character, the main hero of this story, and the book follows his upbringing from his birth to maturity. Towards the end, there is even a girl that he meets called Sophie, who is a kind of perfect woman. And if you remember what we talked about Rousseau and education of women, he believed, of course, girls should be educated because it benefits men. So this is taken from this book, Emile, on education. So Sophie is educated. She is not a complete illiterate and ignorant, because according to Rousseau, this makes women better wives and mothers to men. But there are some concepts present in Emile that were very popular, and they kind of remained important in philosophical discussions about children. For example, Rousseau was strongly in favor of maternal breastfeeding. You might think, what's more natural than maternal breastfeeding? In fact, when he was writing the book in the 18th century, rich women would more often than not hire the services of the so-called wet nurses, that is, paid servants, poorer women, also mothers, so lactating women, who would breastfeed their own children together with the children of rich women for money. So a kind of service job called wet nursing, which was very popular. Rousseau was one of the first philosophers to actually try to convince women to breastfeed their own children. They thought it was unhealthy, they thought it was unladylike, but he was quite effective, at least for a time, to propagate maternal breastfeeding. Another very old practice that Rousseau opposed was swaddling. And you have the image of two swaddled babies here in some old portrait. And as you can see, these little babies are very tightly packed in blankets or sheets, because it was believed that little children are born with very weak bone structure, and if they are not artificially kept still, they might develop in a bad way. So they might develop some sort of illnesses, and their limbs might be crooked or something. So the practice of swaddling was to ensure the development of the baby's bones. Of course, this was not the good way, but Rousseau's idea, his pet idea, like his answer to anything, would be that nature knows best and we should return to nature. So if nature wanted babies to be swaddled, they would be born wrapped in, I don't know, whatever, intestines or I don't know, something. And because they are not born wrapped in anything, they shouldn't be wrapped by people after their birth. So they should be allowed their freedom of movement. And this is most beneficial for their development. And in fact, he was right. Then he believed that the education, especially early education of children, should be in keeping with their natural innocence and goodness. So rather than teach children in this kind of traditional school lesson format, so teach them to read and then make them read books, or to have teachers who would instruct them through discipline and punishment, Rousseau believed that children, especially in the early age, should be allowed natural education through direct experience. So they should be left to play as they wish, to experience the world, not taught to read too early, only when they develop a natural need, a natural curiosity towards book and knowledge, which Rousseau believed could be around the age of, I don't know, 8 or 10 maybe even. Only then they should continue into this kind of school-like education. So this is something that was a new concept in European philosophy, and quite influential, despite, as I said, the flaws in Rousseau's own parenting practices. Then in the 19th century we have some development here, although mostly in the 19th century it is the attempts of countries, of states, to ensure the literacy of the people. So rather than to have this natural early education, the school system is introduced. The way that children are educated is very formalized and very strict and based on authority and discipline and punishment, mostly because of the sheer numbers of children at schools, because one of the important missions of the state, including Western states, Great Britain, United States and other Western countries, is to ensure literacy and to educate the society to function in the modern capitalist society. This is something that's seen as a very big flaw of the modern educational system, the way that it teaches obedience, the way that it teaches submission to authority. We will return to this perhaps when we talk about modernity, but these were the developments in pedagogy and education and child rearing as well in the 19th century, and it starts to change with another great psychological breakthrough at the end of the 19th century in the works of the psychoanalysts, especially Sigmund Freud and later Alfred Adler. He is one of his students. So if you remember, we talked about Sigmund Freud a little as one of the most important intellectuals in the Western culture in general. So whenever we talk about psychological development of individual humans or the expression of human psyche through culture, through literature, through arts, Sigmund Freud and his ideas are still very important. Even though they have many flaws. I would say the biggest flaw in Freud's thinking was that he was so obsessed with boys. His whole theory talks about the development of boys, and whatever he has to say about girls, it more or less could be seen as the legacy of Rousseau, like the girls are there to serve men mostly, and their main function is to catch themselves a man, especially kind of high status man, and to bear his children, mostly sons. So that's perhaps the biggest flaw. But if we look at Freud's theory in a more general sense, as a kind of general history, general idea about human development, there are some interesting things still. For example, Freud was perhaps the first psychologist or intellectual to see the human psyche as containing different parts. This is this division I already mentioned at some earlier stage into ego, superego, and id. It could be seen as the kind of internalized child in id, the internalized adult, the kind of default adult behavior in ego, and the internalized parent figure or authority figure in the superego. It could be also seen as the kind of struggle between nature and the natural impulses in the id. So the id is the instinctive part of the human psyche, the part that is governed by impulses, that wants immediate gratification, and that is very natural in this kind of very basic biological sense, if you think about it. And so nature and culture, kind of personified cultural norms in the superego. So it's like the internalized ideal parent, ideal father, really. The internalized rules and especially prohibitions of the culture. So there is this internal struggle between the id and the superego, which the ego, so the conscious self, has to deal with and has to kind of bring peace between these two conflicting forces. So it goes really very deep psychologically into this basic human conflict within the human mind and within the human society, between natural impulses and cultural impulses. This could be seen, of course, this is the way that Freud saw it, as a kind of idealized feminine on the natural side and idealized masculine on the cultural side. But I think in the modern world, especially in modern culture, it's more complex than that. But this is the starting point. He was writing that in the 19th century and the very early years of the 20th century, so he cannot be blamed for living when he did. So another thing that Freud observed, and this is again the following from Rousseau's ideas, is the development stages in the process of maturation of the human mind. And he was mostly interested in psychosexual development, because generally Freud and the early psychologists believed that the most important impulses in the human psyche, so those natural impulses that are actually pushed under the surface into the subconscious or preconscious parts of the human psyche. So they influence people, even though we are not fully aware of that, are mostly sexual impulses and violent impulses. So this is something that culture tries to monitor and police the most. The aspects of human psychology relating to sexuality and violence. So the theory of psychosexual development is divided into phases, so we can go quickly through them. You maybe heard about them. They are connected with different areas of the body that the little baby, the infant, mostly infant boy, as you'll see, discovers as he grows up. So the very first phase in the development of a baby, according to Sigmund Freud, is the oral phase. Oral meaning something related to the mouth, to the process of feeding, the process of sucking the breast or the bottle. Because in the first year of their lives, babies are mostly interested in feeding. Yes, of course, they want to stay alive. It's a natural impulse. And the baby that doesn't know how to feed themselves through the mouth usually would not survive, especially before the development of modern medicine. So this is something that, according to Freud, influences subconsciously human development. So the way that the caregivers, especially the mother or other people who care for the baby in this time, react to those needs, whether the baby is fed on demand, whether they form a close bond with the mother. If this is met, if these needs of the oral stage are met, the baby develops without trauma. Develops in a harmonious way and passes on to the next stage. If there are some problems, for example, the child is neglected and left to cry and not given the care they need, they experience trauma, and their later development is somehow made more difficult. This is what Freud believed, that human experiences from the time of life that we do not even remember influence us in later stages of development. So the first phase, the oral phase, fixed on the mouth and feeding. Then from year 1 to 3, more or less, of age, there is the anal phase. So the other side of the digestive tract, the elimination of waste from the from the body. This is usually the moment when children are toilet trained, potty trained, when parents discontinually using diapers, and actually toilet training is one of the first types of cultural training that little babies are subjected to. And again, this could be smooth and natural, so children are taken off the diapers gradually. They are encouraged to use the potty, they are praised if they use the potty correctly, and then they develop smoothly through the anal phase. Or it could be traumatic, like children are neglected and they dirty themselves, and they develop later subconscious distaste for their own body and bodily functions, or children are coerced and disciplined, perhaps too early, to use the potty, and punished if they make mistakes and wet themselves or dirty themselves early. So this, according to Freud, could lead to another type of reaction to trauma, that is being fearful of authority. So being overly submissive and trying to please the people, not to be punished. So that's the second phase. The third phase, from age 3 to 6, is the phase that Freud describes as the phallic phase. So this is connected with the genitals, and especially with the boy's penis. So this is the moment when it really becomes important that the main focus of interest for Freud is a boy. So we have little children, like preschoolers, between ages of 3 to 6, discovering the sexual differences between men and women, between boys and girls, and especially observing that boys have a penis, and they pee through the penis, and the girls don't have that. So for Freud, and this is the moment, this is the element of the theory that has been probably most contested. For boys, the penis starts to be associated with authority and power, and for girls, they observe they do not have the penis, so probably somebody cut it off, and they develop the penis envy. Yes, it's not me, it's Freud. And this may lead to this sort of reaction to trauma in girls and women, and the feeling of inferiority towards men. I don't believe that, but definitely this is around the time when children discover the sexual difference, and they get interested in the difference. You may remember something like that from your own childhood, or not, but this is the stage in the development of human, especially psychosexual behavior. Then, from the age of around 6 or 7, so when they go to school, before they reach puberty, which might be around 13 on average, but generally it's the kind of natural process that starts when children's bodies start to mature. We have the latency phase. So this is the moment when little boys and little girls usually play separately in their own gender groups. So boys have boy pals and girls have girl pals, and they develop other social skills not connected with psychosexual development. It's like the Sleeping Beauty phase, the sexual interest, the sexual impulse, even curiosity about the other sex is not present. It reappears during the puberty, and of course it stays with people until the end of their life. And this is the moment when the relationships and sexual orientation starts to develop in teenagers. This was the early early psychological idea, which was later developed by another of the founders of psychoanalysis, Alfred Adler. He was more interested in individual psychology and the development of the human mind, mostly through the imposition of goals. So kind of, he called it the self-ideal, the ambition and the goals in life that people set for themselves. And especially he was interested in the functioning of what he called the inferiority complex and the compensation for the inferiority complex, which is based on the natural assumption that children realize they know less than even older children, not to speak about the adults. So they feel inferior, they feel more ignorant and worse in this kind of psychological sense than older children and adults, and they want to compensate for that by setting goals and trying to bridge the gap and learn new things. So developmental psychology, the psychology that deals with the development of human beings, it's mostly focused on children, but as you will see in a moment, not only. Another type of developmental psychology that was developing in the first half of the 20th century is the so-called Gestalt psychology, initiated by Max Wertheimer, and it's a kind of more holistic approach to perception. He was more interested in productive thinking, in the way that the human mind looks for patterns and connections in the world. The word Gestalt, which is a kind of German word used for this type of psychology, means, roughly speaking, the concept in which the sum of parts constitutes something bigger than each of the parts taken separately. So the combination of parts adds something of value to just the sum of the parts. Okay? So if we take some skills, let's say, separately, they are of course valuable and useful, but if they are combined together, they work together, but they also add the extra value by the fact that they are combined, because they correspond to the psychological desire in people to look for rules and order in the natural world, which is quite random if you think about that. So let's now look at some names, 5 names of psychologists that will be very interesting and very important in the development of the developmental psychology of children, but not only. As you will see, they are not only interested in children, but also in the continuous development of the human mind from birth to death. So this could be useful for many situations in life. If you decide to have children, if you have children already perhaps, this could be useful to know. But also, if you are considering the career in education, and especially in early education, and I know many of you are teaching already or consider a career in teaching, so it's good to know how the human mind develops and how it works. So let's continue. So as I said, 5 names of very important psychologists who are interested in the development of the human mind. The first one is the founder of cognitivist psychology, Jean Piaget, and we'll look at his developmental stage theory. He was a very interesting intellectual. He was very influential in the field of education, encouraging various modern forms of education, such as open education with flexible learning, emotional involvement, personal choice given to the learner as well, collaborative group work, so encouraging interaction between learners and not only this kind of traditional form of education. It's sometimes called the guide on the side versus the sage on the stage. And unfortunately, with the lecture framework, we have the kind of sage on the stage, so me talking to you. It's sometimes likened to the farmer giving grains to chickens, and the chickens just just eat the grains. I wouldn't say it's most effective. It's perhaps good to just introduce certain concepts and certain names, and I hope you're benefiting from it. But definitely in other forms of university education, you'll get more of the guide on the side, so somebody to just encourage your own studies, to allow more personal choice and collaborative work with other students, rather than just lecturing to you. So just give it a bit of time and treat this lecture cycle as the introduction. That's perhaps the best advice I can give you. So Jean Piaget was mostly interested in the field of philosophy. We are going to talk about different fields of philosophy a bit later, but just the first word from this section: epistemology. Epistemology, it's taken from Greek, and it is the study of the nature of knowledge. How people learn, how people gather knowledge. And following Freud, or even to some extent Rousseau, all these psychologists will talk about the developmental stages, so a kind of gradual process of accumulating knowledge, accumulating social skills and other areas of interaction throughout the life. And as you will see, none of them really end their discussion of the psychological development at the point of reaching maturity. So the psychological development, according to these psychologists, continues until the end of the human life. So you can learn something new in terms of knowledge, in terms of skills, in terms of social interaction as well. So let's look at this developmental stage theory of Jean Piaget. The first stage, the first 2 years, is what he calls the sensory motor stage. So the coordination of movement with the information gathered from the 5 senses. So this is what babies do. Babies interact with the world through their senses. As you could see already in Freud, the oral stage, so the touch and the smell and the taste, also sight and hearing, these all add information to the developing mind of the baby. And in the first 2 years of life, according to Piaget, the most important skill that each baby has to master is to coordinate movement of the body, so basically muscle function, with the processing of the information gathered from the senses. So coordination, that's when children learn to interact with the world. This is the basic framework that they will use for later stages of development. Then a small child from the age of 2 to roughly 7, it's the pre-operational stage. This is the stage when toddlers and preschoolers learn language, usually. They learn the meaning of symbolic behavior. So they have the first interaction with the more abstract forms of culture. This is the moment when most babies, like all babies, this is a natural developmental stage. They are very egocentric. They think the world revolves around them and that everybody is just there for them, and everything revolves around them. This is of course a bit annoying for people in the later stages of development probably, but for the baby themselves it's very beneficial. This is the way that the human mind matures, and this is the way that babies and it's not babies, it's like toddlers really, and preschoolers interact with the world. This is when they learn a lot very fast. So within a few years they become fully functioning in terms of motor function. So they learn to sit and to crawl and to walk and to run. They learn a lot of skills like how to feed themselves. This is when they are potty trained. This is when they start forming first interactions within their, let's say, generations, or with the peers. Could be the siblings or the cousins or maybe friends in preschool. This is also when they learn language. For some children, it could even include the learning of the symbolic uses of language, such as reading and writing. Some of you, this is what I remember. When I was 7, I was already quite fluent in reading and writing, and many children do that. So this is quite a difficult and abstract function connected with language, connected with symbols. This is, of course, when children learn the first stories, the fairy tales, the legends, the stories of their family. This is when they start to make sense of the world. So pre-operational stage, they do not really have the full functioning knowledge, but they learn very fast. So then concrete operational stage between the age of 7 and roughly 12. So again, before the puberty starts. This is the time frame corresponding to the latency phase in Freud's theory. So this is the moment when most children start more formal education at school. They start to learn subjects about different areas of the functioning of the world. They learn logical problem solving. This is again a very important template for future learning that they have to master at this stage. So let's say primary school level. Logical problem solving, the identification of problems and solving them by the use of, let's say, brain function. And then from the age of around 12 until the end of the human life, formal operational stage with abstract thinking, with verbal intelligence, with more and more sophisticated forms of social interaction. So this is the developmental stage theory, and future scholars and psychologists were actually developing on that quite a lot. So the next name that I want to give you is the name of Erik Erikson, who was the psychologist. He very often worked in collaboration with his wife, Joan Erikson. They made psychological experiments together. They wrote books together. Their theory is called Theory of Psychosocial Development, and Erikson or Eriksons are credited for that. And as you'll see here, it starts at birth, but it continues until basically their retirement, and then on until the end of human life. And there are more stages, so they go beyond Piaget's stage theory, and they pay more attention to the stages that happen in the adult life. And each stage is marked, of course, with some sort of age framework, and also the main conflict, the main problem that the human has to solve in this age, and the main social interaction, so the main areas of social influence. So let's look at the list. The first phase, so again, first 2 years, the most important interaction for the baby is the mother or the primary caregiver. And this is the phase which Erickson calls the phase of hope. So this is something that a little baby has to master. And the most important decision, the most important conflict, and something that potentially can cause traumatic experience if it goes wrong, is the decision between trust and mistrust. So the baby needs to learn whom they can trust, and usually it's the mother they can trust, so they can develop a very close emotional bond with the primary caregiver. And this is again the basic framework for all future development. The position of trust and hope towards the world expressed through the trust towards the mother. Then between age of 2 and 4, this is the moment in which both parents are important. So not just one person, but ideally a pair of caregivers. And this is the moment when the toddler becomes quite egocentric, and what they discover is the will, the purpose, the driving force of human activity. And the most important conflict they need to solve is the duality between autonomy and shame. So usually at this stage children are toilet trained, and they start learning the rules of society, usually by the fact that they are so egocentric at this stage. They develop their sense of self, they develop their sense of autonomy. They want to test the boundaries of their autonomy, so they will try to negate the parents, for example, to negate the authority, and very often this results in different forms of punishment. It could be violent, it could be just mild punishment to give the child boundaries and rules, but then again this is a kind of internal psychological conflict that the child needs to solve at this stage. So autonomy versus shame meaning the reaction to punishment, the reaction to the acknowledgement of social rules. Then we have the purpose, the age 4 to 5, and the social sphere of interaction is more family members, so not just from one caregiver to 2 caregivers. There is a small family group involving people of different age, for example, so siblings, aunts, uncles, grandparents, cousins, such people. And the conflict, the internal conflict, these are natural conflicts, so something like a problem that the developing mind has to solve, is between the initiative and guilt. So children learn to initiate actions, they discover the purpose, they set the first goals in life. If they are successful, if they are encouraged, good. If not, and this is again an important learning point, they discover the feeling of dissatisfaction, guilt, and they need to learn to process that as well. Then 5 to 12, competence. Children go to school usually at this age, somewhere between the age of 5, including preschool, and 12. They go to school, they learn from the community, they learn from peers at school, they learn from teachers, they learn from neighbors, they learn from the immediate community their family is embedded in. And what they learn is the conflict between industry and inferiority. So children are usually quite creative. They tend to think outside the box. They tend to look for new ways of solving problems. So they might be quite industrious at this time, which is a very positive thing. But at the same time, they discover that there are lots of people older than them, sometimes even their peers, who know more, who have better skills. So they learn the feeling of inferiority. They learn this kind of hierarchical structure of the society. This is usually the moment when they discover that, and they need to find their place in a kind of broader social hierarchy. At school, there are the teachers, so the figures of authority. There are the peers who might have different talents and different skills. So industry versus inferiority. Then the age of 12 to 19, so puberty onto early adulthood. This is the time of fidelity. This is when children learn to form friendships. This is when children learn loyalty. So the most important influence at that time is the peers, the friends, the people from your own generation, and role models. This is the moment when kids usually have personal heroes. This could be artists, this could be influencers, this could be anyone, someone from, I don't know, history, someone from their environment, someone from their community, but they have role models, they look for heroes. And the central conflict is between identity and role confusion. So they develop their sense of self, they develop things like psychosexual orientation, for example. This is the time of puberty, so they have to solve this. So they might be confused in the roles imposed on them by the society, but they need to operate in that. Then, as you can see, we move into maturity, we move into adult life, and there are still 3 more points to go. 19 to 35, so youth, let's put it this way. The time of love, the time mostly marked by partners and friends. So personal, intimate relations really come to the fore. This is the moment when most people find a life partner, when they set up families, when they start having children. This is the time when they become active professionally, so they operate within the framework of friends and colleagues from work. This is when they become members of the local community. So they develop friendships or sometimes conflicts and dislikes towards people, mostly from their own generation, but they also start having families at that time. So 19 to 35, this is the time of intimacy and isolation. So one need, one direction of development is to develop intimate relationships, especially with your life partner and your children, your immediate circle of people, or isolation. They need to be able to recharge your batteries, to be left alone sometimes. Then 35 to 65, so maturity basically. You might say middle age or full maturity before the age of retirement. This is marked by care, and this is basically the bulk of human adult life shared between work and family relations, mostly parenthood, and so generativity and stagnation. The need to be productive and creative and contributing in your life, towards the fear of just being too complacent, too stagnant in your ways of thinking, in your ways of problem solving. This is something that you will probably learn when you enter this phase. I would say, yeah, well, that's it. And the last one, according to Erickson, is the stage of wisdom. The older age, the time of reflection on life, the time of summing up your achievement in this lifetime, which may be torn between ego, integrity, and the potential fear of despair through illness and mortality encroaching. What is important is that, according to Erickson and many other developmental psychologists, not everybody reaches the last phase. Well, some people die earlier, that's one thing, but even if they live long enough, they may not reach the full potential of their psychology. So it's not that everyone will end up to be being an old, wise person. You may be old, but not necessarily wise. You have to struggle, you have to try and develop your mind to reach the stage of wisdom. The next name I'd like to mention is Albert Bandura, the psychologist who was mostly interested in social learning. So he studied learning behavior, and before his experiments, it was generally believed that people learn through instruction, through being taught. You need to be taught to learn something. Bandura observed that children mostly learn through observation, and it is not purely behavioral. It's a kind of cognitive process. So the mind processes the information, and this is how we learn. The observational learning of life models, verbal instruction, symbolic observation, for example, in the media or in arts, is as important as regular instruction. And there is a very famous experiment that Bandura made, and this is called the Bobo doll experiment. It was made in the 60s. And the idea was that he had some children, and the children observed an adult model, so the kind of assistant of the psychologist, actually hit physically a kind of big, soft doll. This was called the Bobo doll. It's like the kind of punching bag, but with the kind of rudimentary human features on it. So children would see an adult attack a doll, a punching bag. So punching bag. And then the children were subjected to some frustration. So they were made a bit anxious and irritated by, taking something away from them or leaving them for a while to get frustrated. And then they were left alone with the doll, with the Bobo doll. And most children, and mostly boys, they actually started to mimic the behavior of the adult models and punching the doll themselves, even if, as it was later shown, they sometimes only saw the recording, they saw the film with the model, with the assistant punching the doll. So this was the first observation that led to this whole, theory of social learning and the way that observation and role models and even symbolic models are important. Two more names. The next one is Jane Levinger, and she coined something which was called the theory of ego development, which is a reworking of Erickson's theory, again with multiple development stages, 9 in this case, again functioning throughout the human life. And again, she said that not everybody reaches the final phase. So let's see. The first one, pre-social, for the baby. We talked about it so many times. Then impulsive, the egocentric small child. This follows more or less the idea of Piaget and Erikson. Then self-protective. So this is the time when children, the preschoolers, learn self-control. This is when they need rigid order, when they need some sort of repetitiveness in life. This is when they start learning social rules. Then the conformist stage. For most school children, this is when children start obeying rules. As simple as that. Then the self-aware stage. This is interesting. This is what she says that most typical early adults, like 25-year-olds, reach this stage, and many people stay in this stage forever. This is the stage centered on interpersonal relations. This is the stage when people are kind of well-grounded, aware of themselves, their body, their place in the world, but that's it. You can go 4 more stages from that. So the next one would be the conscientious stage with self-imposed goals, ideals, and responsibilities. This is when most people want to achieve something in life rather than just to float through life. This is the importance of freely taken responsibility of fulfillment of goals, of setting up certain ambitions and ideals to fulfill. Then, point 7, the individualistic state with a broad mind and larger tolerance. This is when people basically start to observe and respect the needs of others. This, as you can see, it goes in a kind of direction towards more inclusive, tolerant, developed stage. The last two, the autonomous stage, the stage of synthetic thinking, of seeing the larger picture, and self-fulfillment. It kind of corresponds to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you look at it. So first, the basic needs need to be fulfilled until we reach this self-actualization or even self-transcendence, which would be seen in this last integrated phase, which is characterized by wisdom and empathy towards others. And as Levinger said, it's rarely achieved. So again, you can be old and not wise. You need to try and do it in your own life. We'll leave the last one for the next moment. Mm-hmm. So the last psychologist I would like to introduce to you is Diana Baumrind. And she was interested in parenting styles, and you can see a little table here with 4 types of parenting styles. But if you think about it, it's applicable not only to the parent-child relations, but also to the teacher-learner relations. So especially if you are dealing with young learners, but I would say in any kind of social interaction with a kind of hierarchy involved. So somebody is in the position of more power or knowledge or authority over the other person. 4 things can happen. So first of all, you have to decide whether the relation is supportive or not supportive. So in terms of parenting relations, it is the parent who supports the child, who is there for the child, who is present. This is the kind of child-centered types of parenting. However, it could be also the student-centered learning styles or teaching styles, and generally providing support and encouragement from the person in authority to the person lower in the hierarchical order. Of course, it's not always like that. Some parents are unsupportive. They could be rejecting. They could be just absent and neglectful. But the same can happen with the teacher. There are some teachers who just don't care. That's one very important variable, whether the relationship is supportive or not supportive. The other one is whether the relationship is demanding or undemanding. Again, it's a different category. So parents or teachers can be demanding. They put some goals before the child or before the learner, and they ensure that these goals are met. They set boundaries. They set some sort of learning stages for the child or the learner. Or they are not demanding, they are neglectful, they are just not there, they don't care. If you want to learn, you can learn. This is I think what happens quite a lot at the university, because we assume you are adult and you can take care of yourself, so you should be able, students, by this time, to be putting the goals before yourself on your own. So the difference between the theory and the practice, yes. The idea is that by the time you go to university, you should be able to teach yourself, to learn in your own pace. However, of course, we try to help you. So here we have these two things: supportive, unsupportive, demanding, undemanding. And on the crossroads of these two categories, there are four styles. Let's look at the three, let's say, less useful and less positive types of parenting styles or teaching styles. The first one is when the parent, let's call it parent, is demanding and unsupportive. This is authoritarian parenting. This is the controlling, power assertive, very disciplinarian form of parenting, or also of teaching. You may remember, perhaps, I hope not, you had such teachers maybe in your life, those who were unsupportive but very demanding, kind of the figures of very strict discipline and control. You might also have parents or children who are both unsupportive and undemanding, so they just don't care. They neglect or even reject the people in their care. So they are uninvolved, they are not there, they miss classes, they neglect the children, and they are basically not there. So there's hardly any parenting or teaching involved here. Then another possibility is that the parent or teacher is supportive but not demanding. So the relationship is indulgent, there is very little control or discipline, so you can do whatever you want, which may be good perhaps in some private contexts. So it's nice to have one parent like that, perhaps. Or some close relatives like that who just support you no matter what. Many people have memories of grandmothers being like that. Not very demanding, but very supportive. They will just be all there for you, but they will not ask much. But in the learning context, well, perhaps it's not the best thing, because you'll spend a lot of time learning and not learn a lot effectively. The best style is what Baumrind calls authoritative parenting. Not authoritarian, mind you, the words are similar, but it's a completely different concept. But authoritative parenting or teaching. So both supporting and demanding. The relationship is responsive, reciprocal, and kind of based on mutuality, based on respect in both sides. So you have a lot of support and encouragement, but at the same time, high standards and high demands, which are really enforced not through coercion or control, but through the kind of internal respect that the child feels for the parent or the student for the teacher. And that's it. I hope you find it useful. If you teach now as a kind of student teachers, perhaps in language schools or privately, try to think about the style of your teaching, and we continue next week. Thank you.